I recently spoke with a man in Tokyo, and his job title is specialized cleaner. He doesn't do offices or, homes. He clears out the apartments of people who died entirely alone, and they're often undiscovered for months. He talked about his work with this chilling, detached professionalism. He was describing the specific way floorboards warp under a body that's been left too long in the summer heat. To him, this wasn't really a tragedy. It was a booming industry, a growth sector, he called it, of modern life. He told me with his slight, almost ironic smile that this is just the final invoice for absolute autonomy. To this man, these silent rooms, they were the ultimate expression of a society that had finally gotten the freedom it always said it wanted. But then the Japanese state's reaction took a turn that felt less like social work and more like a mobilization for war. On January 4, 2026, the government didn't respond with some public health campaign or a call for neighborhood volunteers. No, instead they formally appointed a minister of loneliness. And at first glance, that title, it sounds almost whimsical, doesn't it? Like something out of a fairy tale or a sentimental Hallmark card, a government finally acknowledging the broken hearts of its people. However, when you look at the actual 2026 policy briefings, all that sentiment just evaporates. The language is not compassionate, it's forensic. The state isn't worried about people feeling sad, they're worried about civilizational entropy. They've started to view the 40% of the population living in isolation not as citizens who need a friend, but as corroded human capital that is causing the entire national machinery to seize up. The minister isn't there to provide comfort. He's there to execute a top-down technocratic repair of the social fabric. It's this cold realization that the extreme pursuit of individual liberty has metastasized into a national security threat, and it's forcing the state to step in and violently re-stitch the very connections that modern people work so hard to sever. It raises a pretty haunting question. When your personal freedom starts to look like a slow-motion civilizational suicide, at what point does the state decide you no longer have the right to be alone?
That framing is, wow. The final invoice for absolute autonomy, it's chillingly accurate for what we're going to examine today.
It really stuck with me.
I can see why. And what's truly fascinating, is that the state's massive intervention, this minister of loneliness, the law to combat isolation, it wasn't born out of some sudden humanitarian impulse.
It wasn't about feelings.
Not at its core. It was born out of structural necessity. So our deep dive today is focused entirely on dissecting the mechanics of that structural breakdown.
The breakdown of the Japanese social contract.
Exactly. We're going to look at how this really volatile combination of intense historical collectivism and more recent shift toward hyper-individualism has created a social crisis.
A crisis with a real price tag.
A severe and measurable economic price tag. One that the government, quite simply, can no longer afford to ignore.
Okay, so let's unpack this structural failure. I want to get into some concrete numbers, some definitions, because when the government starts using language like civilizational entropy, we need to translate that into something tangible.
We do, and civilizational entropy is a cold, technical way of saying the society is running out of useful energy.
Like in physics.
Precisely. Think of entropy in physics. Right. It's the measure of disorder, of decay in a system. For a state, this isn't just about people being unhappy. It's the slow, measurable decay of a society's functional capacity.
So fewer workers, fewer innovators.
Fewer taxpayers, fewer innovators, strained social welfare budgets, and the escalating cost of managing the human wreckage created by this isolation. The state looks at 40% of its population and sees a drag on the system.
A drag that reduces its ability to generate economic growth or even defend itself.
Exactly. And that's the core mandate of this Minister of Loneliness. Execute a mandatory administrative repair of the social contract to stop this collapse.
So this is a quantified threat. Let's look at the baseline data point for that threat. How large is this crisis officially?
The scale is staggering. Japan was compelled to enact a specific law to prevent loneliness and isolation.
Which is a huge step.
A massive step. And the baseline data point that triggered this political action is that this crisis officially affects an estimated 39% of the population.
39%. That's almost 4 out of every 10 people experiencing isolation so severe that it registers on a government survey.
Right.
That's not a niche mental health concern. That is, as you said, a national emergency. It's eroding the very human capital you need to run a complex industrial economy.
And while 39% is the broad baseline, to really grasp the depth of this social withdrawal, we have to look at the extreme edge of it.
The phenomenon known as hikikomori.
Exactly. Hikikomori.
Now, we hear this term a lot, But let's define it precisely for this context. Sociologically, what does hikikomori represent?
Hikikomori describes individuals who suffer from a really severe social withdrawal. We're talking about confinement to their homes for extended periods.
Well, extended.
Often months, in many cases years, and crucially, they cut off contact with pretty much everyone outside their immediate family.
So they retreat from everything.
Completely. School, work, any kind of social life, it's gone. When the phenomenon first got public attention back in the 90s, it was often framed very narrowly. People saw it as, severe shyness or maybe just a family issue.
So why did that perception shift? Why is it now considered a major structural crisis and not just an individual failure?
Well, the sheer numbers have changed, for one. And the root causes have been tied back to a structural failure in society itself.
It's a society-bound syndrome.
That's what researchers call it. Initially, estimates were, in the tens of thousands. Now, depending on the age bracket and the definition you use, some estimates place the number well over 1 million people.
1 million people.
Over 1 million. It's just become too pervasive, too persistent to be dismissed as some kind of personal eccentricity anymore.
So if the issue is structural, what are the key factors pushing people toward this kind of total withdrawal? It almost sounds like the system is designed with this as an escape valve.
That's a great way of putting it. That's precisely what the research suggests. The system itself generates the pressure. And one of the most dominant factors is the intense academic stress, the rigor of the Japanese educational environment.
The entrance exams.
The unrelenting pressure of the entrance exam system, which can determine a person's entire career trajectory.
And the famous Juku system, the late-night cram schools.
Exactly. Children are socialized from a very young age to understand that success is this zero-sum game tied to one specific outcome, passing the right exam to get into the right university.
And if you don't?
This environment creates these profound feelings of inadequacy and shame upon any perceived failure. If a student struggles or fails an important exam, the shame can be so intense that they see complete social withdrawal as the only way to avoid facing judgment.
Judgment from everyone.
From peers, from family, from all of society. And then you have to layer on top of that employment insecurity and the massive career expectations on young graduates. If they don't land a secure, high-status job, that disappointment can be crippling.
So the system demands perfection, but it offers almost no room for failure or experimentation or even just a gap year to reset.
None. So withdrawal becomes the ultimate, albeit tragic, coping mechanism. It's a self-defense mechanism against societal judgment.
What does that do to someone psychologically?
Well, commonly observed symptoms among hikikomori include significant depression, anxiety, and just this deeply ingrained low self-esteem. And the isolation and these mood disorders, they feed into a worsening cycle.
A downward spiral.
It is, because the longer the withdrawal lasts, the harder reintegration becomes. They experience a severe decline in social skills and emotional resilience, the very skills you need to face the outside world again.
Things like just talking to people.
Interpersonal communication, problem-solving abilities, they just wither away in the darkness of their room.
That sounds like a cruel, self-perpetuating trap. Why aren't more families and individuals seeking help through standard medical channels?
And that's the big cultural barrier. The stigma around mental health issues in Japan is still a massive impediment. Seeking help is seen as admitting a fundamental flaw.
Not just for the individual, but for the whole family?
Yes. The shame is inherited. Families often feel deeply embarrassed or they believe they'll be socially blamed for their loved one's condition.
So they hide it.
The prevailing cultural attitude is to keep personal problems private, especially anything concerning mental illness or, failure. So families actively keep the situation hidden, sometimes for decades.
Which just makes the isolation worse?
Catastrophically worse. This is what leads to the 80-50 problem. You have 80-year-old parents struggling to care for their 50-year-old isolated hikikomori children, often in poverty.
And the parents become isolated too.
They become isolated caregivers, too afraid of the shame to reach out for community support.
That's such a powerful illustration of the vicious cycle. It's no longer just an individual tragedy. It's a failure of the entire social infrastructure.
Right.
Which brings us directly back to the state's concern. If this many people are locked away, how is the Minister of Loneliness quantifying this social tragedy as an economic disaster?
That's the exact transition we have to make. We shift from pathology to a quantifiable economic threat. The state views this massive group of isolated citizens as corroded human capital.
Corroded human capital.
The national machinery is seizing up because a crucial component of the productive workforce is simply absent. Research shows a clear economic impact of this social atomization on Japan's industrial productivity.
And it connects back to the family structure, too.
Yes, there's a distinct correlation between the erosion of traditional family structures and the decline of long-term labor efficiency, especially in high-output STEM sectors.
Okay, so let's translate that corrosion into the national balance sheet. What's the measurable cost of the hikikomori phenomenon?
Well, first, it creates a substantial workforce deficit. And this is at a time when Japan is desperate for workers because of its aging population. These individuals, who are largely in their prime working ages, they remain unemployed or severely underemployed.
So they're reliant on their families.
Heavily, which drains personal savings and eventually places a completely unsustainable burden on social welfare systems.
And it's not just the direct cost of support, it's the loss of potential, right?
Precisely. It's the loss of human capital that could be contributing to productivity, innovation, tax revenue. When you have this massive chunk of young, often highly educated people who are now completely disengaged,
you lose a critical source of dynamism.
Dynamism and entrepreneurship, gone. They're no longer consumers contributing to the market, and they're not innovators developing new products. It acts like a slow-motion recession, constantly dragging down potential growth.
And this is where that crisis of human capital directly collides with these massive top-down political efforts to inject life back into a stagnant economy.
Absolutely. We have to look at the actions of former Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's administration between 2021 and 2024. He stated that Japan had to abandon the decades-long deflationary policies that kept wages low and corporate cash reserves high.
He wanted a new model of capitalism.
Nothing short of it. His goal was to implement redistributive policies to boost wages and expand the middle class.
Which sounds like a monumental task, trying to reverse 30 years of economic inertia. What were the tangible results of that effort?
The results were actually significant. It showed that structural intervention can work. His time in office saw Japan achieve its highest wage growth in 3 decades.
How did they manage that?
It was largely driven by aggressive targets set during the annual labor negotiations. It was a clear political move to structurally repair the economy by injecting demand. But this whole push happened under immense external pressure.
The pressure being the shifting global economic hierarchy.
Yes. In late 2023, the International Monetary Fund predicted that Germany would surpass Japan as the world's 3rd largest economy.
A huge symbolic blow.
Massive. That imminent downgrade just underscored the urgency behind Kishida's entire political project. Jumpstart growth, combat stagnation. Before Japan permanently slips out of that top tier, the economic fix had to be pursued at the same time as the social fix.
That necessity raises a deeper historical question for me. If the government is so willing to step in now and aggressively redistribute wealth and re-engineer society, how was Japan's massive post-World War II economic success built in the first place? It wasn't a free market nirvana, was it?
Oh, far from it. That success, which saw Japan rise from ruin to become this global industrial powerhouse, was profoundly state-led. It was classic state capitalism.
Driven by the government.
Driven by massive government assistance, protectionist policies, and intentional central planning, most famously through the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, or MITA.
So, compared to the American model, what did that state intervention actually look like in practice?
It was an incredible case study in directed development and aggressive wealth redistribution. The post-war policies were designed to literally reset the deck. They included extensive wealth redistribution efforts like extremely high progressive taxes.
How high are we talking?
At one point, wealthy earners were paying 45% on incomes over $270,000. And most dramatically, the direct confiscation of elite wealth.
Confiscation, that's a strong word. How extensive was that?
It was one of the most thorough wealth redistributions in modern capitalist history. The post-occupation era involved stripping the elite of significant assets. This wasn't just land reform, it was seizing assets, land, corporate shares, wealth held in bank accounts, often with near confiscatory tax rates.
Wow.
This forced reset essentially created a more egalitarian base from which their form of capitalism could grow. They also had heavy government investment in infrastructure, subsidized and nationalized transportation.
The famous rail network.
The rail network remained state-owned until the 1980s, and of course they received massive aid and investment from the U.S.
So, The Japanese miracle wasn't just raw competitive capitalism. It was state capitalism, built on a foundation of aggressive state intervention and, crucially, intense demands on labor.
That's the critical socialist critique often leveled at the time. The success was achieved by treating the general population's time, health, and stability as expendable resources.
The priority was institutional output.
Institutional output above all else, which led to the work-until-you-die culture and practices like karoshi. The current crisis of isolation and stagnation, which has persisted for decades, really underscores that the problem now isn't just about market forces, it's about the failure of the human element, a direct consequence of that earlier punishing model.
Which explains why the government now sees this intervention as a strategic necessity.
It's why the shift from hands-off liberalization to technocratic state intervention is viewed as a necessity for maintaining national resilience.
It makes perfect sense that a state that historically has shown a willingness to violently rebalance its economy now feels justified in rebalancing its social structure. Now that we understand the economic fallout, let's explore the social architecture, this paradox of hyper-collectivism leading to mass isolation.
Right. We're moving into the cultural roots of the pressure. Sociologists describe the foundation of Japanese identity as something that is actively made and taught.
So your identity is rooted in learning how to be an individual in relation to the collective.
Precisely, which is fundamentally different from a Western individualistic society where the self is supposedly discovered internally, independently.
Here you're defined by your context.
Your group, your school, your company. The process of forming a self happens by learning how to function seamlessly within and in relation to others. And this starts the moment children enter the public school system, which is attended by over 98% of students.
So what are the specific mechanisms in the education system they use to enforce this mandatory cohesion?
The examples are everywhere. They're completely integrated into the daily routine. From age 6, children are taught to clean their own classrooms, to serve lunch, to manage daily responsibilities.
There are no janitors.
No janitors. Everybody has a mandatory rotating role. This instills a profound sense of responsibility and group belonging.
And what's the overarching social goal of all this constant group-based socialization?
They're cultivating something called omoyari. The concept means empathy or consideration for others. It's about being so aware of the group's needs that you anticipate them without even being asked.
So the goal is for children to care deeply about a group member's success or loss as if it were their own.
Yes. It's a beautifully powerful mechanism for social cohesion.
But as with all high-pressure systems, there has to be an inverse, the dark side to that cohesion.
And there is. The dark side is the mechanism of collective punishment and shame. Think of omoyari as wearing a kind of collective armor. It protects the group, ensures stability, but if you step out of line, that armor instantly becomes a harness designed to inflict pain through shame.
One person's mistake is everyone's mistake.
Precisely. And this is enforced through practices like public shaming, a teacher scolding a first grader in front of the entire class for some minor infraction. It's how you learn, often painfully, how to avoid shame for the rest of your life.
It becomes a deeply ingrained, almost physiological effort to not get it wrong.
A lifetime effort. And the consequence of this intense risk-averse system has to ripple up into professional life and into governance.
Of course.
It creates an extremely obedient, compliant, and deeply risk-averse society. In the political and bureaucratic spheres, this fear of making an error or disrupting consensus leads to decision-making characterized by gridlock.
So everything slows down.
Every single stakeholder, every bureaucrat, has to be included in the consensus-seeking process, which slows down large-scale, swift collective action to an agonizing crawl. Now, once consensus is finally hammered out, things move incredibly efficiently, but getting to that point can take years.
And what is the human cost to the workers who are embedded in this system that prioritizes institutional output over everything else?
The ultimate cost is karoshi.
Death from overwork.
It's not just a metaphor. It's a recognized sociological and often legal phenomenon where people die from exhaustion-related stress or heart attacks from working inhumane hours. The historical societal success was explicitly built on treating the general population's time as expendable.
Which has to be creating a generational rift.
It is. This culture of absolute obedience generates deep discomfort and unhappiness among young people today. They look at their parents and they refuse to accept that same fate. They see the lack of personal flourishing and they seek an alternative, which often leads them toward withdrawal, and that helps explain the rise in hikikomori.
We often hear critiques that Japan lags behind places like the US or China in fostering disruptive, high-speed growth innovation. Does this culture of conformity and risk aversion directly explain that lag?
Absolutely. The system is fundamentally hostile to the outlier. The high risk aversion makes it incredibly difficult to cultivate entrepreneurs.
The mindset is just all wrong for it.
The mindset required to start a company, the tolerance for dramatic failure, the willingness to publicly bet everything, is seen as shameful and deeply disruptive to the collective. And we see this borne out in the data. The entrepreneurship rate, even among successful university graduates, is extremely low.
The Japanese model just doesn't favor that high-risk, high-reward outcome.
No, it doesn't.
So if Japan isn't built for that disruptive, high-speed growth, what is its specific, refined role in the global innovation landscape?
Japan excels at the final polish. They take existing products or concepts invented elsewhere, like video games, cars, or digital cameras, and they get incredibly granular, detail-oriented, and otaku obsessive about refining them.
Making them perfect and useful.
Perfect, useful, and beautiful. Japan's innovation is about quality, not necessarily scale or initiation. And this approach could even shape their future role in areas like AI ethics. They might apply concepts like omotenashi, that deep, selfless anticipation of a customer's needs, to how AI interacts with people. The focus remains on making the technology truly useful for society, rather than simply achieving initial massive scale.
That structural pressure, the need for total obedience, the fear of shame, the prioritization of institutional output, all of that funnels down into the most fundamental unit of the collective, the family. So let's look at how that pressure cooker environment is fracturing the home.
Yes, we've arrived at the core fracture point. Despite decades of government policies promoting work-life balance and laws encouraging female professional advancement, the traditional division of labor within the family unit persists with a stubborn and destructive force.
Let's ground this in some data to show the scale of the problem. What is the breakdown of domestic labor?
The statistics are damning. In married couples with children under 6 years old, mothers spend an average of 7 hours and 34 minutes per day on housework and childcare.
7.5 hours. And fathers?
Fathers, meanwhile, spend an average of only 1 hour and 23 minutes.
That's nearly a 9-to-1 ratio difference.
Yeah.
In dual-income households, which is increasingly the norm, this is the definitive reality of the second shift.
It is. It places an immense, often impossible burden on women, forcing them to juggle demanding professional careers with the vast majority of domestic labor. This severely limits their ability to fully realize their professional capacities, which was the stated goal of that 2015 law promoting female career advancement.
And it has to be linked to low morale and low birth rates.
Directly.
Okay, so we have some fascinating cross-sectional research that looked at fathers, segmenting them by child age, preschool versus elementary school, to explore what factors actually drive their domestic involvement. What was the one universal factor that transcended age group?
The universal, most powerful factor was time constraint. Plain and simple. For both age groups, working 40 hours or less per week significantly increased the time fathers spent on housework and childcare.
How significant was it?
The statistical analysis gave an adjusted odds ratio of 2.35 to 2.81. That means for fathers who worked shorter hours, the likelihood they would spend significant time on domestic duties was nearly 3 times higher.
That is a massive statistical flag. It suggests that individual desires or, policy initiatives around fairness are secondary to the simple physical constraint of time.
Exactly. If you're at the office for 60 hours a week, you simply cannot be at home sharing the load.
It's just physics.
It is. Now let's break down the specific factors for fathers of preschool children ages 0 to 6. This group's needs are often more immediate, more time sensitive.
So what drives involvement in that early chaotic stage of child rearing?
For fathers of preschoolers, shorter commuting times, specifically less than 1 hour round trip, were strongly associated with increased domestic time. This finding strongly supports the time constraint hypothesis. If you have a 2-hour commute, that time is simply lost.
So policy could actually address that.
And policy suggestions flow directly from this data. Things like enhancing housing allowances to facilitate living closer to work. It's a tangible link. Housing policy directly impacts father involvement in childcare.
That's a powerful realization for policymakers. Now, what about fathers of elementary school children aged 7 to 12? Do the same variables apply?
They showed different factors. The universal 40-hour work week still applied, but specific to this older cohort, one novel finding was that working from home more than once per week significantly increased their time on domestic tasks.
Well, that makes sense.
Remote work naturally increases the time available at home, making engagement easier.
And what was the second, more structural factor for this older cohort?
The second key factor was the spouse's employment status. Fathers whose wives were regular employees, meaning full-time professionals, spent significantly more time on housework and childcare than those whose spouses were part-time or temporary workers.
So why would the wife's full-time status make such a drastic difference?
This supports what's called the relative resource hypothesis. It's a really interesting idea. It posits that when the difference in resources between the couple-like educational attainment and, crucially, earning power is smaller, the sharing of housework becomes more equal.
It's about parity.
When the wife's earning power is closer to the husband's, the marriage shifts psychologically from a kind of service model, where the wife supports the husband's career, to an equitable partnership model. That parity demands shared labor.
So we have data proving that individual good intentions just fail against structural constraints like long work hours and commutes, and that truly equitable sharing is driven by the wife's professional status, a societal achievement, not a private arrangement.
The study's conclusion is unambiguous. These factors are not amenable to fathers' individual efforts alone. They require systemic change.
From companies and from society.
Specifically, corporate and societal changes to improve work arrangements and flexibility. They necessitate breaking down the deeply entrenched cultural perception that a man's primary and sole valuable role is occupational.
And finally, why should the government care beyond simple social justice? What is the national benefit of this structural repair?
Because it is directly linked to demographic survival. The research found a strong positive correlation between increased father involvement and better spousal relationships, improved mother satisfaction, and a higher likelihood of the couple having a second child.
So there it is.
Structurally repairing the family relationship is essential for reversing the country's declining birth rate. It links social repair directly to demographic survival. The cost of maintaining the rigid, shame-based, long-hour system is, quite literally, the failure of the next generation to be born.
It is a holistic failure. Economic stagnation, social withdrawal, demographic collapse, and it all points back to the same structural rigidity born of hyper-collectivism.
It does.
Which is why the state used this intervention as a strategic necessity, moving us into our final analysis. Technocratic repair and the pursuit of national resilience.
And this is where we revisit the Minister of Loneliness. His role is defined by the need for this top-down, non-sentimental, technocratic repair of the social fabric.
A mandatory administrative repair.
A mandatory administrative repair of the social contract designed to halt that civilizational entropy we talked about.
So how does the government plan to structurally address the hikikomori phenomenon, which is the most acute symptom of this entropy?
The intervention framework is comprehensive. It begins with early detection.
In schools and workplaces.
Implementing screening for signs of social withdrawal in schools and workplaces, catching the issue before it leads to total confinement. And this is coupled with widespread mental health education to reduce that systemic shame and stigma.
And for those who are already isolated, what are the actual intervention strategies?
They're multimodal. The framework combines psychological treatment like cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, which shows promise in helping individuals change negative thought patterns, with sustained social support systems and critical family counseling.
So it's about healing the family unit, too.
The goal is to address the psychological core while simultaneously reskilling the family to be a safe haven rather than another source of pressure.
And what role does the community play in this government-mandated repair?
The plan mandates the establishment of community-based programs and support groups. These programs are explicitly designed to reduce the powerful social stigma surrounding hikikomori and to encourage gradual social re-engagement at the individual's own pace.
Fostering a genuine sense of belonging outside the punitive structures of the academic or corporate world?
Exactly. The underlying philosophy, remember, is systemic preservation.
Let's look at the broader strategy for national resilience under Kishida's administration. We see the state acting on two fronts at the same time, addressing the internal collapse and bracing for external geopolitical pressures.
That's the strategic genius, or perhaps the strategic necessity, of his policy push. Kishida focused on childcare investment and defense mobilization as two inseparable prongs of a massive national resilience strategy.
So on the domestic front?
On the domestic front, he made childcare a priority for 2023, announcing a plan to double the country's children-related budget.
Doubling the budget is a huge shift. What did that money target?
It was aimed at increasing monetary child benefits given to parents, expanding daycare slots, and aggressively combating child poverty. It's a massive investment in future human capital.
And an attempt to alleviate the financial pressures that contribute to the reluctance to have more children.
Yes. And even with this effort, critics argued the policies weren't effective enough to raise the birth rate immediately, but it signals this unprecedented commitment to reversing decades of demographic neglect.
And the second prong, defense mobilization, was even more radical in terms of historical shifts for a pacifist nation.
It was an epic historic shift in Japan's defense posture, reacting to what the National Security Advisor called its most severe security environment since World War II.
So what did that look like?
In late 2022, Kishida instructed the cabinet to increase Japan's military budget by a colossal 65% by 2027. This aims to reach the NATO target of 2% of GDP,
Which is an enormous amount of money.
a $320 billion increase in military spending.
That's the most significant defense budget increase in decades. What geopolitical actions accompany that spending?
A huge push for security partnerships and a relaxation of previous military constraints. Kishida signed robust security pacts with key allies like the UK and Australia, formalized the American-Japanese-Korean Trilateral Pact in 2023, and aggressively strengthened ties with the Philippines.
And they're loosening constraints on arms sales.
His administration has been subtly loosening traditional military constraints by approving sales of arms overseas and revising rules to allow weapons to be sold to countries other than core partners.
So the interpretation is clear. The state is conducting a comprehensive, holistic repair. They're addressing the internal social and demographic civilizational entropy with technocratic social policies while simultaneously bolstering external geopolitical defenses.
It's a full-spectrum structural preservation project.
Exactly. The government is focused on structural integrity on all fronts, but this aggressive top-down intervention has to meet the complexity of a society that is itself struggling to define its purpose.
It does.
So does the younger generation, the one that grew up under all this stagnation and pressure, do they still adhere to that risk-averse, obedient culture?
Well, while institutions are very slow to change, there is a definite emerging generational shift. Young people are showing a growing inclination to use individual power and move away from absolute obedience.
Is there an example of that?
The high school baseball world, which is a microcosm of national collectivism, recently saw a major shift away from the compulsory shaved heads rule, a powerful symbol of extreme conformity. High-profile schools are dropping the rule, and others are following. The value system is subtly changing.
Young people are less willing to sacrifice their individuality just for the group's perceived success.
That's it. So there's this bubbling desire for individual expression and influence, but the society itself hasn't yet settled on a new collective purpose to replace that post-war pursuit of growth.
The core of the cultural balancing act.
It is. The ultimate societal goal is being questioned. Should Japan pursue solely financial growth, chasing the high-speed U.S. model? Or should it pursue a more purpose-driven approach? There's an emerging feeling that the goal shouldn't be growth for its own sake, but a focus on local community support and polishing existing quality.
Seeking flourishing and vibrance over sheer scale or volume.
They're searching for a sense of real collective purpose that doesn't demand total self-annihilation.
So we started with the specialized cleaner's observation that extreme autonomy was the final invoice, resulting in these silent, lonely rooms. And we end with the state's drastic, cold reaction to that realization.
The policies implemented, from the Minister of Loneliness to the systemic push for increasing father involvement and the massive defense buildup, they demonstrate this cold, hard realization that extreme autonomy, when scaled across an entire nation, leads inevitably to structural failure.
So the state is deploying powerful, systemic, and non-sentimental tools to violently restitch a social fabric that has been systematically severed.
Severed by the competing pressures of hyper-collectivism in the workplace and the relentless pursuit of individual, isolated autonomy at home, the government's actions show that when societal disintegration reaches a critical point, the state is prepared to mandate the very connections modern people worked so hard to dismantle.